In the interest of practicing interview scenarios, what I've done is I've set up so I have a prompt and I've copied that prompt across here so I can have something to look at. But I'm going to try using the voice mode of ChatGPT because I want to generate a bit more conversational style of interview and something that gives me something to sort of respond back to. So I've just generated a fairly straightforward prompt here. I'm going to start this up, I'm going to start discussing it, and hopefully I get some follow-up questions that are very naturally based on what I've already said. So I don't know how this is going to work. I've fiddled around with this a little bit. Wasn't super great. It was interrupting me a bit, not giving me much time to think. But I think that's okay. We'll try it out, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. So I'm just going to read it. I've read it already, but I just want to get it sort of in my head so I can start talking about it once I click this button. So my first thoughts about this is that I need to be respectful of my position. I'm a junior doctor. I'm not in a position of authority over the senior consultant. My other thoughts are also that, well, the primary issue in this is it's not foster. So this is what I was worried would happen. Oh my God. All right, so I'm not going to do that. I think I'll just answer the question without follow-ups. And then off camera, I'll fiddle around with this a bit, see if I can get something working. So my main concern about this is that it's not fostering a positive team dynamic. Um, if the nurses feel like the senior consultant is hostile towards them, they're not going to be, morale is going to be low. And morale is very important for any workplace. And while I don't think this means the nurses are going to necessarily do a poorer job for the patients, I think it does increase the risk potential of this happening because if they're not enthusiastic about their work because of the way this senior consultant is treating them, it's going to lead to poorer patient outcomes. And so that's one point. But then even if we put aside for a moment the patient outcomes, which is our priority, but even if we put that aside for a moment, it's also not pleasant to work in an environment that makes you uncomfortable, no matter what the position, no matter what the stakes are. So this is an issue both, that I've linked to the patients and also just a personal issue for the nurses. Now, other considerations I have is the senior consultant genuinely being condescending, or is this just his communication style? Because he might not be feeling condescending towards them. He might not have this perspective that he's above them. And the problem might be that the things he's saying are coming across that way for whatever reason. So I don't want to immediately think, oh, the senior consultant needs to reevaluate how he thinks about people, because it might just be that, he might be a poor communicator. On top of that, so I want to touch on the point where the nurses appear uncomfortable but don't say anything. Uh, to me, I'm wondering what exactly makes them appear uncomfortable. Is it their body language? Have I overheard them talking about it? How certain am I that these nurses really are uncomfortable? Because maybe I'm projecting my discomfort about how he's speaking to them over to it, but it might be the case that if I'm new to this environment maybe I'm looking from the outside on a dynamic that has been established and accepted that isn't necessarily negative. Maybe I think they're uncomfortable and I think that he's been condescending, but maybe what I'm interpreting as being condescending is direct, and maybe the nurses in fact appreciate that. And while I don't want to make that assumption, I'm saying that, I don't really want to be making any assumptions, and I don't want to be making decisions based on what I'm, the little about the situation that I'm seeing. So how I'd approach this is, if I'm in a position to, I think I'd speak to the nurses and I'd say, and it's difficult because I don't want to be talking about the senior consultant behind his back or appearing to spread rumors or do anything untoward. But, I would want to approach the conversation with the nurses, because if this is something that bothers me, I'd like to address it. So I talked with the nurse that hopefully I'm close to. I'd imagine being in a working environment with them, I would have developed rapport with these people, or at least I'd hope so. And I'd say I've noticed during ward rounds, and that's quite specific. If he's otherwise quite gentle and lovely with them, I'd have to wonder about that in terms of why is it in this specific environment that he's speaking to them this way. Is this a particularly stressful event for him? Something he isn't good at, because maybe that negative emotion is coming across as him being condescending. And so that sort of touches back on my point before about where his intent lies. So on top of that, yeah. So how I want to address this situation is I want to speak to the nurses, and I'd say, it seems like he's speaking condescendingly to me during ward rounds. Is that the general feeling of the nurses as well? And I'd say, and hopefully it all goes well. And they say, oh, no, 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 he just gets a little bit stressed. We understand. We give it back to him too, that sort of thing. Comfortable workplace environment. And that's sort of the key issue that we were talking about before, whether the workplace environment is comfortable. And if that's good, then that's fine. I can leave it at that. But then if they start going off about how, oh yeah, he's really unpleasant to work with, especially during ward rounds, then I don't know. I'm not sure what I'd do right at this point. But hopefully I have a mentor or someone else I can speak to about how to navigate the situation. Because as it stands, if I try and apply this to my current experience, I work in kitchens, and if one of the head chefs or sous chefs was being really rude to the kitchen hands, and I spoke to the kitchen hands, and he said, yeah, they said it makes me uncomfortable. What I do would then depend on my relationship with that specific chef, or in this scenario, with the senior consultant. Because if this senior consultant is a direct mentor of mine, or I have an otherwise close relationship with them, then it may be appropriate for me to open up that conversation and say, I don't know, or say, I'm kind of uncomfortable with how you speak to the kitchen hands, or in this scenario, the nurses. But I mean, now that I've framed in my perspective, I mean, that feels inappropriate no matter what my relationship with, I'm just going to keep saying senior consultant. That feels inappropriate. I think, I mean, maybe we should look at this in a more systemic, open point of view. How are we building these hierarchies, and what's the hospital doing to ensure that senior staff aren't being dismissive of the lower staff? Because we're all important in the hierarchy. There's no better person. We just have sort of different roles, and these different roles have more responsibilities attached. So I think it's important that I'm aware of, I guess, hospital policy and how we're supposed to act in these situations, rather than just making assumptions. But I think that's all I have time for. I would have liked to cover more about that dynamic between the systemic level and the personal level. I think I covered a lot of information about the personal level without really discussing hospital policy, and I don't know if it's really relevant to the question, but we could have covered, I guess, workplace culture as well as a whole. How are doctors treating nurses? Has it become acceptable for this senior consultant to speak to nurses this way because of what he's experienced in other workplaces? Maybe he's seen, as a junior doctor, maybe he's seen senior consultants speak to nurses that way before, and he's just seeing it as acceptable. And then I would have liked to touch on how do we address that more systemic problem. But like I said, I ran out of time a little while ago. I'm otherwise quite happy with how I covered that question. It's a shame that the AI thing didn't work, but I think I'll look into that more because I think that would be a helpful resource rather than me ranting for 10 minutes about the prompt. I would have liked to have a bit more back and forth. But I think as is, I covered most of what I wanted to cover. And I think my point of view was quite nuanced, while also staying firm with my perspective that it's not a very healthy environment to be in. Although looking back now, maybe I didn't stress that enough. I did talk a lot about maybe it was okay because of this and that, and so that might have come across as being, I guess, accepting of the behavior, as written. It's just difficult to find a balance between having a nuanced response and understanding that the realities of these situations often are different to what they appear, while also taking a stand on, inappropriate behavior, which does happen. But overall, I felt my confidence was good. I think I covered it quite well and didn't stumble too much. So I'm quite happy with that as well. And yeah, I'll be back to cover another one at some point in the future. Thank you.